Welcome back to the world today. Let's get the latest on the Russian-Ukraine crisis. One person has been killed and 23 others, including a child, wounded in a Russian missile strike on an apartment block in the southern Ukrainian city of Mykolaiv. Video released by Ukraine's emergency services shows firefighters working on site damaged buildings. Regional Governor Vitaly Kim says that the emergency services put out several fires caused by the missile debris and that they are clearing the rubble. Russia denies deliberately targeting civilians in its full-scale invasion that has killed thousands of people, uprooted millions from their homes and destroyed towns. Mykolaiv, a shipbuilding center and port, had a population of about 470,000 people before the war. The city has suffered heavy Russian bombardments throughout the war. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian artillery unit has fired an American-made howitzer near Bakhmut as Ukraine's military was rumored to be preparing for a counteroffensive. Andriy, a 22-year-old gun commander, said in a hideout near the artillery position that although the American-made weapon was first used in the 1980s, it had one big advantage over Soviet-made guns. Another Ukrainian soldier says it has become more difficult to hit Russian troops in the embattled town. The General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces said fighting gripped Bakhmut and nearby areas. It said Russian forces had failed to advance on two villages to the northwest. At least a dozen localities came under Russian fire. Meanwhile, the defenses visible in the satellite imagery taken by Capella Space are part of a vast network of Russian fortifications sweeping down from western Russia through eastern Ukraine and onto Crimea, built in readiness for a major Ukrainian attack. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops have been training in the west to use different military assets on the battlefield in a combined way ahead of a counteroffensive Ukrainian officials say will come when its forces are ready. A Ukrainian counteroffensive could change the dynamics of a war that has slowed into a bloody battle of attrition, and military experts say the length of a front at about 1,200 kilometers could stretch Russia's defenses.
They're trying to limit Ukrainian movement. So what the Ukrainians will seek to do in their offensive is to pierce the Russian line and then rapidly drive their military vehicles to the coastline or into rear areas. And so the length and the width of these defenses is structured to prevent that. So you have at kind of the front, you have the ditch, which is to stop armored vehicles or to at least make it difficult for them to advance. Then you run into the Dragon's Teeth or Devil's Teeth, which is another tool to make it harder for them to advance. And then only then will you encounter the primary defensive trench, which is where the Russians will be presumably shooting at them the whole time. Russians have the river on one side, they have the ocean at their back, and in a way that traps them, but it also allows them to concentrate their defenses, because fortifications like this, with earth-moving technology, they're not necessarily hard to install, but if you've ever dug a ditch of any size, you know that it's a great deal of effort. And so when you have a kind of area like this that you know you must defend, that's a little bit smaller, thanks to geography and thanks to the overall stabilization of the front, it makes sense and is possible to create defenses like this in order to restrict Ukrainian movement. And I think that that's true, that's more evidence of the way that the war has stabilized and the way that the war going forward is going to be, in a sense, less dramatic at the strategic or macro scale, but in a lot of ways more dangerous for the people involved. This is an age of war in Europe that was thought to be over. And so we're kind of going back to this kind of conflict. And I think that the scale would be interesting and remarkable. The Russians have quite a lot of territory to defend in terms of this area all the way from the Dnieper eastwards, and they're aware of it.
In the meantime, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says China represented an opportunity to reinforce the rules that peace should be built upon after a telephone conversation with President Xi Jinping. The two leaders spoke yesterday for the first time since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, fulfilling a long-standing goal of Kyiv, which had publicly sought such talks for months. President Xi told Mr. Zelensky that China would send special representatives to Ukraine and hold talks with all parties seeking peace. Mr. Zelensky also said President Xi had expressed words of support for the extension of the deal to export Ukrainian grain from its Black Sea ports. Meanwhile, China has called on all sides to reflect on the situation in Ukraine and seek a new way to reach peace in Europe. Chinese state media says during the phone call, President Xi told his Ukrainian counterpart that China would send special representatives to Ukraine and hold talks with all parties seeking peace. President Xi, the most powerful world leader to have refrained from denouncing Russia's invasion of Ukraine, made a state visit to Russia last month. Since February, he has promoted a 12-point peace plan for Ukraine, greeted with skepticism from the West, but cautiously welcomed by Kyiv. President Xi also told President Zelensky that China will focus on promoting peace talks and make efforts for a ceasefire as soon as possible. Following the call, President Zelensky immediately signaled the importance of a chance to open closer relations with Russia's most powerful friend, naming a former cabinet minister as Ukraine's new ambassador to Beijing. And a Chinese official says the Chinese President Xi Jinping's phone conversation with his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky shows that great importance China attaches to growing its relations with Ukraine and China's willingness to maintain cooperation in all fields. Yu Jun, the Deputy Chief of the Department of European Central Asian Affairs of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, noted that China and Ukraine, as strategic partners, have maintained the steady growth of bilateral relations, kept close communication, and developed economic ties over the past few decades. While COVID-19 and the outbreak of the conflict has affected much, it hasn't changed the trade relationship between the two countries. On the Ukraine crisis, he said that since the full escalation of the war, China, as a responsible major country and a permanent member of the UN Security Council, has been committed to promoting peace talks in an objective and impartial manner and has stayed in communication with the relevant parties. On the other hand, the Kremlin says it welcomes anything that could bring the end of the Ukraine conflict closer when asked what it thought of the phone call a day earlier between Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Ukrainian leader. But the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said it still needed to achieve the aims of what it calls its special military operation in Ukraine. Mr. Peskov said Russia was familiar with the details of what the two leaders had discussed and said their stances on the conflict were well known. Asked if Russia and China had discussed restoring Ukraine to its 1991 borders during a recent visit to Moscow by the Chinese leader, Mr. Peskov said there was no discussion of that issue at all. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has welcomed the first phone call between the two leaders since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Mr. Zelensky described the hour-long phone call as long and meaningful and said President Xi of China had expressed words of support for the extension of a deal to export Ukrainian grain from its Black Sea ports. Mr. Stoltenberg also said NATO allies had delivered almost all their promised combat vehicles to Ukraine.
Call between President Zelensky and President Xi. I think it's important also that China gets a better understanding of the Ukrainian perspectives. This doesn't change the fact that China has not been able to condemn Russia's illegal war, illegal invasion of Ukraine. Overall, through the contact group led by the United States, NATO allies and partners have provided unprecedented support to Ukraine. More than 98% of the combat vehicles promised to Ukraine have already been delivered. That means over 1,550 armored vehicles, 230 tanks and other equipment, including vast amounts of ammunition.
And finally, on the program, President Joe Biden and his South Korean counterpart Yoon Suk-yeol have celebrated their ironclad partnership, marking the 70th anniversary of the U.S.-ROK Security Alliance. South Korea's Yoon Suk-yeol and First Lady Kim Kon-hee joined the Bidens at a state dinner in the East Room of the White House after the second day of President Yoon's April 24th to 29th state visit. Other guests at the dinner included General Mark Milley, Chairperson of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Antony Blinken, Secretary of State and actress Angelina Jolie, and her son, Maddox Jolie Pitt.
At the end of the memorial, there's an engraving that reads, President Yoon and Ms. Kim joined Jill and me at the Korean Veterans War Memorial. At the end of the memorial, there's an engraving that reads, our nation honors her sons and daughters who answered the call to defend a country they never knew and a people they never met. It's a solemn reminder that our alliance was born out of not shared borders, but need. Shared beliefs, a belief in democracy, liberty, security, and above all, a mutual belief in freedom. You know, this visit is about reaffirming all that unites our two nations. It's about a commitment to bear one another's concerns and listen to each other's dreams. It allows us to overcome every difficulty and with great determination. That allows us to move further and faster in space, cyber, technology, and in all areas that matter most to our future. We stand at an inflection point, many of you have heard me say before, where the decisions we make now are going to determine the course of our future for decades to come. But I've never been more optimistic, and I mean it, I've never been more optimistic about our nations, what we can achieve together if we continue to work together as allies and as friends.
That's our program today. Thank you for watching. I'm Joke Rogers.